My name is Scott Foley, and today I'll be showing you how to rebuild the Volvo R.E.A.D unit. It'll always be the Volvo R.E.A.D unit to me because I've been a Volvo specialist pretty much all my life. It's also used on some of the Land Rovers as well as some of the Jaguars, but I think it's most commonly found in the Volvos. This is the R.E.A.D unit, and if you've seen my other video, it goes into an explanation of exactly what the R.E.A.D unit is, why they use it. So I'm going to skip over that. And we're going to kind of go straight into the rebuilding process of the R.E.A.D unit. I'm going to bring the camera in a little closer so you can watch what I'm doing. As we go through this R.E.A.D unit rebuild, I'm going to be sharing with you some of the things we've learned in the past 5, 6, 7 years that we've been doing these. So the first thing is the gear drive. In the past, we used to just leave these in the block and not worry about it, but then we started seeing some failures of these bearings, and here's one right here that's jammed up. Most of the time you can get away with reusing this drive gear with that bearing. However, you should pull this out of the block and check to see if that bearing is bad or not. If it's bad, we'll be addressing that a little later in the video, what the options are for that. But you should pull that out, check that. The next thing is the one-way clutch. This one-way clutch, you should check it. It should spin freely one way and it should lock up the other way. You shouldn't see any rust. It shouldn't have any play in it. I have this theory that these one-way clutches failing is actually what damages or ruins the bearing in the R.E.A.D unit. I think what happens is they lock up and it starts to beat up the bearings, and that's what causes them to fail, because you have a lot of them that don't fail. All the ones I've rebuilt have plenty of oil and lubrication in them, so it's clearly not a lubrication issue. Through process of elimination, the only thing we've come up with is this failing. And these fail quite a lot. If you're someone who right now is watching this video thinking your R.E.A.D unit's bad because you hear this noise coming from the area of the R.E.A.D unit, I strongly suggest you take the belt off, start the car, and listen to see if you still hear the noise or not. If you still hear the noise, then more than likely it is the R.E.A.D unit. If you don't hear the noise anymore, then it's usually not the R.E.A.D unit. I would be looking at the one-way clutch, also looking at the idlers, the water pump, as well as the AC compressor. All those things can make some similar noises and sound like it's coming from the R.E.A.D unit, but this is probably the number one cause of noise, and that is this one-way clutch. There's also another one-way clutch just like this on the other side of the R.E.A.D unit, well, on the alternator. So it's not quite the other side of the R.E.A.D unit, but it's on the alternator. And you should also check that to make sure that one's working okay. That one we don't think has any effect so much on the R.E.A.D unit and the R.E.A.D unit bearings, but what it does do is the centrifugal force loosens up this bolt. We've had a lot of these cars towed in with this bolt loosened up because the one-way clutch was bad on the alternator. So if you're doing a rebuild or you got this thing apart, if you're a shop doing this, you don't want the car getting towed back in, a week later, like we did one time, because the one-way clutch was bad on the alternator and this bolt came loose and the charging system obviously stops working. Hopefully our experience will prevent you from having that same thing happen in the future. So remember, check the one-way clutches, both the alternator and the R.E.A.D unit. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take this drive gear off. So I loosened the bolt up just a little bit, and they do make some pullers and tools, but I found it's pretty simple to just tap the bolt with a hammer, the screwdriver underneath of it. So you just put a screwdriver with just a little bit of pressure, and there you go. Take that the rest of the way off, and we'll just set that aside, and we don't need that until we're putting it back together. The next thing to do is to get this seal out of there. I usually start by putting some penetrating oil. This is not a product plug, but my favorite penetrating oil for years has always been Z45. I'm sure you can use just about any type of penetrating oil, just so that soaks down in there around the seal, and as it comes up, it makes it just a little easier for that seal to come out of there. To make it a little easier, I put it in the vise, making sure to grab it here and not the sealing surface here. You don't have to, don't clamp it down too tight because this case is somewhat fragile. It's not eggshell fragile, but this kind of thin aluminum. And I just take, in the repair manual, I provided a link to the repair manual from Volvo on the website. You might have seen that. If not, if you're seeing this video on YouTube or something, you can always go to volvo.re.com. I've got some information on there. We also sell rebuilt R.E.A.D units, some parts if you want to do it yourself, the tools, some of the tools. So in that repair manual, they show you putting a screw into the seal, and that's supposed to pull the seal up out of there. Well, that's never worked for me. It usually just strips out the seal. So I take a screwdriver, and I make a little cut in there. With a smaller screwdriver, and I take my bigger one. And then just, probably should tighten it down a little more. Just try to be careful. And then just pull that seal up out of there like that. And throw that away. There is a big snap ring down here that holds this bearing in on this side. So just go ahead and pull that snap ring out. So that's it for tearing apart this side until we get over to the press. This part is probably one of the most difficult parts of doing the R.E.A.D unit. This sprocket is torqued to 300 foot-pounds. Volvo sells the special tools. There's two tools to take this off, and I think they're in the neighborhood of around $1,200 or $1,300 for the two tools. And usually I find when you go to order something like that from Volvo, it takes about a month to get it. So if you got a car in your shop and you got the R.E.A.D unit sitting on your bench, if you try to get the tools from Volvo, then it may take you a month to get them. However, we started producing these. This is a tool that allows you to take this off. I sell them on my website. I sell them on eBay. If you need them, I have them in stock and ready to go. So this one goes on the sprocket. This one goes on the center shaft there. This is a standard thread. The sets I sell, they have a little cap with a bolt that actually will hold them in place. I've kind of gotten to the point where I don't use those anymore. So it's 3/4 inch, and we lock this down in the vise. Now I can see the next step I might get some negative comments about. I know you're going to tell me don't use a torque wrench to break it loose, but I've been doing it for a while. It's a cheap torque wrench, and it's just my habit. And I only have one 3/4 inch torque breaker bar, so. So this is on the sprocket. And I'm going to back the camera up just a little bit so you can see this. This is torqued to 300 foot-pounds. I don't know if it's because I'm not that strong or 300 foot-pounds is a lot, but I struggle with this torque wrench getting them loose. So you might find this entertaining as well. I use a lower control arm tool. The vise is getting a little worn out. Only about 35 years old, so let's try it again. Okay, we got it loose. I'm going to go ahead and move the camera back in. There we go. Need these to put it back together. Set this back there. And now we can just screw it off by hand. It's very fine thread. And again, there's a big snap ring right here. So I'm going to go ahead and throw these snap rings in this gear in the parts washer. So now we're ready to move over to the press. Volvo sells a bunch of special tools for setting this thing up. Bushings, press. As long as you got some regular press tools, sockets, that kind of stuff, you can do this without buying all those. So let's move over to the press. We're going to start with this center shaft that goes through and presses out. Let's go ahead and set this up in the press. We're going to lay the press blocks so they go across here, avoiding this little nub. So we're going to go ahead and put it in here, making sure that nub is not hitting. So we make sure that nub is not hitting the press blocks. Center it up. And make sure that when the bearing comes out, it's going to clear. It's not going to hit our press blocks. Now, here's one of the really important things when you're doing this job, and that is that we need to heat up the case in order to press that bearing out of there. Otherwise, we risk cracking this case. Volvo recommends you use a heat gun. I find the heat gun's kind of slow, so I've used the map torch. So just heat up the case. Maybe about a minute or so. It's starting to get kind of hot, so that should be sufficient. Just enough to get the aluminum to expand. So now we're going to bring the press down. I always keep my hand underneath it so that if it falls out, I'll catch it. It usually won't come out just yet. When I get down flush, it still won't come out. I'm going to take a little socket and put it on there once I get it flush. You can see how easily it presses out now that the case is hot. Now it's pretty close to being out, but we do need to press it just a little bit further than flush before it'll come out the bottom. All right, so we got the socket in there. Push the rest of it out. Yeah, it just dropped out of my hands. So there you can see, there's the bearing shaft. I'm going to pause right here for just a minute to give you a little bit of information. The rebuild that we're doing is just replacing the bearings. I sell a kit on my website, and you can do just the bearings. Volvo sells a complete kit, which includes bearings, these shafts, this shaft, that bearing, this gear, essentially everything inside here. You've just reused the case. It also comes with a new drive gear bearing. So that's the Volvo kit. And like I said, they're pretty close to $1,000 to do it that way. We found that most of the time it's just the bearings that have failed. Every once in a while we'll find these shafts that the roller bearings came apart and they'll have a big groove here. If you run into that, you can buy just this shaft from Volvo. Back when we first started doing this, they didn't sell many of the parts separately. You had to buy that kit, so you were just kind of stuck with having to buy the whole kit. I decided to start sourcing the bearings so that we could rebuild them like this, and we've been doing that for quite a few years. So again, inspect this shaft, make sure that this area here is smooth, but this area right here where the roller bearing rides is fairly critical. So I'm just going to set that aside for a minute. Now the next thing is to press out this center shaft. Now this, you've got to be really careful because this is where you could crack the case if you don't do this properly. You see there, that center shaft is pressed into this gear as well as that bearing. So we're going to get a spacer that is wider than that center shaft to support it from underneath. And then we're going to press it down from the top. We can just press right on there with the press, and that'll drive it all the way out. So let me go ahead and get the right. So I've got the spacer, or this press adapter. I need a little bit more of a gap, I need a little bit more depth so that the case doesn't hit on my press blocks. So you can just center up one of your press blocks, put it next to the spacer on there. All centered up. Now, no heat is needed for this, but it does get a little loud sometimes. Now, I always keep spinning this housing as I'm doing this to make sure there's no pressure on the housing. And I pay attention to the press, make sure I'm not getting caught on that, on the spacer that I have in there. You can see it just dropped through. Now that that center shaft is pushed out, you can go ahead and pull out the gear. Set that aside. The next thing is to press out this bearing. That's the last part of the disassembly of the R.E.A.D unit. And we're going to go ahead and throw that away. Now, set up the press blocks, and it'll catch right on the surface. It's pretty parallel. So we'll get it all centered. Next, we'll go ahead and put our press tool in there. That's going to push that bearing out. And then we need a little more depth to that. So we'll go ahead and set that up. Now, we're going to drive the press down and just put a little bit of pressure, just to hold everything in place. Now we're going to use the torch to heat up the case again. This is a pretty thick bearing, so we want to make sure that this part of the case is really warm. And the boss extends out there, so it'll heat it from both the top. I'm going to pull that rubber seal off. Make sure you replace that before you put the R.E.A.D unit back on, or you'll have quite an oil leak. Go ahead and heat up the case. Heat up the inside, and we'll heat up the boss on this side. Again, if you want to follow the instructions and use a heat gun, that works too. Okay, so I say that was about a minute of heating. The one downside to this is I'm going to be catching a hot bearing now when it comes out the bottom. I can always use my rag to prevent that. So we start to press, and it's moving pretty easily, so we're good. Now we just want to keep an eye on it, make sure nothing gets hung up. Sometimes you get the wrong size press pushing and it gets caught up. So this press you can usually hear when something's binding up. But it's moving really smoothly. Just dropped out the bottom. And we can throw the old bearing, bad bearing away. Sometimes that bearing fails, sometimes the other bearing that we pressed out fails, sometimes both of them fail, sometimes the roller bearing fails, which is part of the reason why I believe that one-way clutch may be locking up and beating around all those bearings. I'm going to go put the case in the parts washer. I'm going to put the gear and that center shaft and this in the parts washer. We're going to I'll clean those up. I don't think you need to watch me clean the parts. And then we'll come back and we'll start by pressing this bearing in, and we will have to do the roller bearing that's in there. Okay, the other parts are still in the parts washer. I cleaned up this center shaft we took out first, and now we're going to replace the bearing for the center shaft. First thing we're going to do is take this little snap ring off the center shaft. So take that little snap ring off. And then we're going to go ahead and press this center shaft out of the bearing. We need a bearing cage. Now, another lesson I learned, be very careful that you have plenty of clearance for that gear as it comes through there, because I did that once and chipped the tooth. So now we're just going to press that center shaft down. Presses out pretty easy. And now we're going to press out the bearing out of this holder. Make sure we catch the edges of the holder and we're not underneath the bearing. Now you just need a bushing or some sort of socket that catches the inner race. Now this bearing sounds a little angry sometimes. Sometimes it'll go flying out the bottom, so don't be shocked. See, there you go. Like I said, sounds a little angry sometimes. I'm going to go clean up this bearing holder and the shaft, and then we'll come back and we'll put the bearing back in it. Okay, so we got a shaft and the holder all cleaned up. And we got a new bearing. I'm just going to press it all together at the same time. Push these close together because all we need to do is clear that little center shaft. Straight as possible. The center shaft will be pushed in there much easier. Looks like we're just a little bit crooked. Go. We press the new bearing into the bearing holder. Now we're going to put the snap ring back on. Clean it up a little bit. And there you go. So that part's ready to go back into the R.E.A.D unit. We're going to go back over to the rebuilding area, and we're going to replace that roller bearing that's inside the other center shaft, or the intermediate shaft, maybe you'd call it. So this is, we're going to call the intermediate shaft, and there is a roller bearing down inside here that center shaft rides on, the area that I was explaining earlier to make sure is okay. Here's the part here that rides on the roller bearing. So again, we inspected that earlier, and you can see it comes through there and it rides like that. So we're going to go ahead and pull out the old one and put in a new one. Now, sometimes that clip can be challenging. What I find is if I put it in the vise with the rag wrapped around it so it doesn't get damaged, although this area here is what goes in the center of the bearing, so it's not critical if it gets a little scratch, but I find it's easier to have the vise hold it for me while I get that snap ring out of there. Not quite sure I can give you a good angle while I'm doing this, but it's just a snap ring, and I just use a couple picks, get in behind it. Okay, got the snap ring off. That ended up taking me a couple minutes, but I cut the video a little short so you didn't have to sit there and watch me fight with it for a little bit. It wants to pop up and then drop back in and pop up and drop back in. I'm thinking somebody out there probably makes a tool to do these, but the only thing I've ever found is picks. Careful as you're taking that out. I've had them go flying across the shop. Never to be found again. We'll just clean that up with a rag. So here's the roller bearing, and this one's still in good shape. As a matter of fact, this R.E.A.D unit here wasn't in bad shape. I just bought it as a core so that I could rebuild it and sell it. So we'll go ahead and throw the roller bearing back in the trash. We want to inspect the surface in here. Of all the hard parts, the bearings aside, the only thing I've ever really seen damaged is this inner surface when the roller bearing goes bad, and this center shaft when the roller bearing goes bad. And both these parts are available separately from Volvo now. Again, they weren't when we first started doing this, so you can buy this piece separately. Sometimes I buy up some used R.E.A.D units, cores, and then I have some extra parts lying around. So I'm going to go ahead and clean this out just one more time with some brake clean and some compressed air. Okay, I got it cleaned up. Got my roller bearing. I'm going to drop that in there. And I'm going to go ahead and put that clip back in. I think I'm going to put it back in the vise just to make it a little easier. Clip goes in much easier than it comes out. Just drop that right down in there like that. And if we want, we can just test that fit, make sure everything's good. There we go. So this is all ready to go back together. I'm going to go finish cleaning up the actual housing, and we'll go back to the press and get on to the next step. Now I'll stop for just a second here and tell you that if you go and buy the kit from Volvo, you don't need to do any of this stuff. All you do is the pressing in and out of the parts. So, you wouldn't be replacing this, you'd get this in the kit. You wouldn't be doing anything with this, you get this whole thing in the kit. Pretty much just what we do at the press is what you would be doing. You take the gear off, take the two clips, you take the seal out, take the gear off, the sprocket, go to the press everything apart, clean up the case, press everything back in, because again, you'd be getting all new hard parts. This, however, would save you, you can buy the kit, I think, for under $200, so save yourself $800 by reusing the hard parts that are still good. Okay, so we've got our case cleaned up and ready to go back together. Got all the old gasket material off of the mounting surface. Set it up there for now. We got the gears cleaned up, we got the center shaft, intermediate shaft, and we got our new bearing. Set these pieces over here for now. Okay. So first thing is the big, large bearing goes in. If you buy the kit from Volvo, you will have to do it this way. If you get the bearing separately, you have to do it. It's the same process. You'll need a press bushing or support that will catch the inside of the housing, because we're going to be pressing the bearing in here, and we'll crack the case if we're not supported underneath of where the bearing is going in. Alright, so we got the right size now. You can see it goes in, catches that inside lip. Of course, we're going to need a little more space, or spacer here. We got this. Okay, that all set up. We retract our press. We get our bearing. bearing in there. Get everything lined up. I'm going to put just a little bit of pressure down on that bearing, just to hold everything in place. And now we're going to heat up the case again. Again, I'll probably cut some of this out of the video, but I'll probably heat it for about a minute. Sometimes you can even just start pressing the bearing to see if it's going in easy or not. It seems to be going in pretty easy. So we'll get rid of the heat. And we'll go ahead and put the rest going in. You see there's not a lot of pressure. It's not taking a lot of pressure to push that bearing in because... Now as you get down in there, you need to be careful because the aluminum is thin on the inside as well. You'll notice the snap ring groove over here. There, I can feel the press tightening up, and that's how I know that the bearing is all the way in there. So we're going to back off the press. Set our press bushings aside. Now the next part is a little tricky. Not terribly, but a little bit. So we got the gear that this intermediate shaft is going to come up into, and it's going to press into the intermediate shaft at the same time it gets pressed into the bearing. The bearing is a double ball bearing. You'll see that it has this plastic lock in it to hold the two halves together. If that drops out, the bearing tends to want to come apart. So you have to put the gear in here, put the intermediate shaft through the center of the gear, start to come up through the bearing, and while you do that, you have to hold the top of the bearing down and push out the plastic lock. So you can see how the ball bearing wants to come up out of there. It's not too big a deal to get them back in, but it's just extra work. So you just keep pressing down on the bearing while you press that intermediate shaft up inside there. Now, this is one of the part I was saying is tricky, that you have to keep pressure up on that intermediate shaft now, because if you let it drop down, the inside ball bearing race, or inside set of bearings, is going to fall out. So I set it sideways like this. I'm going to need to get a bushing that size to press this into the bearing and into the gear. And that one seems to work pretty well. And we need one that is going to go over this shaft and onto the bearing. Okay, you need to make sure you catch the bearing and not the intermediate shaft. Okay, so it looks like we got a bushing for the top and bushings for the bottom. Now, it's critical you make sure that the bushing on the bottom stays centered. You can catch the housing if it's not. So let's center this up on here. And I'm feeling the bushing on the bottom, make sure it's centered. This is centered. And push the bearing, or I'm sorry, push the intermediate shaft in. Now, I keep spinning the housing to make sure that no pressure is being put on the housing. That way I don't have to worry about it cracking. Just drive that intermediate shaft down in there. you see that the case is starting to hit on the press blocks. So I'm going to need to put another spacer underneath of that bushing so that I can press it the rest of the way in. And I can also watch the center bushing there to see whether it's centered as well as feeling it. So everything looks lined up now. Now if you want to spend $1,000 and buy all the tools from Volvo, you don't have to play around quite as much with all the different bushings. There you go, it's all the way in, so didn't take much more. Put our bushings back. Our spacer. So, you see now we've got the new bearing here, we've got the intermediate shaft pressed into the gear. Now what we have to do is the center shaft with the bearing housing. Now, if you look through the Volvo manual or any other manuals, there are some special tools. There are rods that go through this, through here, and then it supports the housing like this, and then you press the bearing in so that the case doesn't crack. I've made some to do that. However, what I found is that I like to stay away from the press. I heat this up enough, tap the bearing housing right back in. I'm going to set this here. So the key is to heat this up really well. Get our torch. And I may heat this for maybe 2 minutes. So one of the things I look for, I noticed to start to see a little bit of smoke rising up off the case. That tells me it's pretty hot. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to slide our center shaft with the bearing and the bearing housing in there. It feels pretty warm, and I didn't even have to do anything. It just slid right in there. It's all the way in. So you can go out and you can buy all the special jigs, and you can buy the tools, or you can heat it up a little bit and just slide it, or if it doesn't quite go in all the way, this is what I normally do, is just tap it like that and it goes right in. You can save yourself a lot of time doing it that way. Okay, so that finishes the R.E.A.D unit work on the press. We're going to move back over to where I disassembled it and put the final pieces back together. All right, so here we are back at the disassembly area, I'll call it. We've got our R.E.A.D unit bearings have been pressed in. We've replaced all 3 bearings. Okay, so the next step is to put the snap rings back in. Clean those up. I did wash them in the parts washer. There's still a little bit of cleaning solvent still on them. And you can make sure it pops in there. Wipe this one down too. Make sure that one popped in there. Now, from here, you could do the seal next, or you could do the sprocket next. We'll go ahead and do the sprocket next. A little more exciting, 300 foot-pounds of torque. You can watch me with my big bar. I locked the vise down. I think we'll be good there. Just go ahead and thread this back down on there. Hold this gear to get it down tight. Now we're going to get our special tools. Now we remember which way we're going to be turning this, so that we put the tools on, we're not hitting the tools together. This will be going clockwise, so we'll put this on the other side. Lock this back in the vise. I'll get my torque wrench, and we're going to crank it up to 300 foot-pounds, which is the max for this wrench. And there we go, 300. And we'll lock it down for safekeeping. We can start out by hand a little bit, just to get it all the way down in there. And now you can watch me get my big control arm tool. And pull on it until we hit the hook. I like to hit it quick 3 times. So they go 300 foot-pounds. So I've yet to see anybody do this job without these special tools. I did have a guy one day tell me, oh, I was able to get it off. I got it off without the special tools. And when I got the unit, there was a tooth missing off the sprocket. I'm going to take it out of the vise. Get the special tools off there. Again, special tools for sale on my website. A little shameless promotion. We'll come back in here now. So we've got the sprocket back on, we've got our bearings, we've got our everything. All that's left is to put this seal back in. And of course the sprocket. So here's the seal. Now, the special tool is nice to have. It's not required. I know a lot of people do it without this, but it sure makes it a lot easier. This little cone will put the seal down over the shaft there. Take that off. Again, I like to use a little bit of oil to help that seal slide in there. So we screw this down until it's flush with that center shaft. And there we go ahead and screw this down. Get our 14 millimeter wrench. We'll get our 15 millimeter wrench. And we will start to drive that seal in there. Now, you'll get to a point where the center shaft will start to spin down there. Usually you can just hold it with your fingers while you drive the seal in. See, it's going in there. Bottom's out. Back that off a little bit. Put that little cone back on there so we're not looking for it the next time we do this. So the R.E.A.D unit is essentially rebuilt. I'll go ahead and put the drive gear back on. I like to put some Loctite on this bolt just because I've seen these things come loose so many times. So let's set that on there. I'm going to get my Loctite. Okay, so I've got my Loctite on the bolt. I'll go ahead and put it in there. This bolt gets torqued to 35 foot-pounds. It's nice if you have the special tool to hold the pulley or hold the drive gear. It's not necessary. If you have a pair of channel locks with some rags, 35 foot-pounds is not going to create much of an issue. So let's set it up to 35 foot-pounds. Here we are. Get our socket. There we go, 35 foot-pounds. Okay, so now the unit is ready to go back on the car. Now, we're going to go back to the drive gear. I'm going to set this aside. I said we'd come back to these drive gears earlier on in the video. When Volvo first started having problems with the R.E.A.D units, they came out with a bulletin and said it was actually this bearing that was causing the noise. We've all found out otherwise since then. We found out it's those bearings that we just replaced in the R.E.A.D unit. However, every once in a while we do see one of these tapered bearings that is very tight. This one won't even turn. Sometimes they're rusty. Probably about 1 in 10, this bearing is bad. The only real solution to that is to buy the updated gear and bearing from Volvo. It's a double ball bearing instead of the roller taper bearing, but it's slightly larger in diameter than the original roller bearing. So you can't use that. You can buy these bearings separately. I found those, but it doesn't fit in the old style gear, only in the new style gear. Now, there was an idea that I've been playing around with and have never got to test it, and that is I found these ball bearings. They're the same diameter as that roller bearing, and if I put the two ball bearings together with this washer in the middle, it's the same exact size as that taper bearing there. But I've never gotten a chance to test it, so I don't think that I can endorse it at this point. But if you're one of those people who are adventurous and want to give it a try, you can contact me on the website volvo.com, and I can sell you these bearings and washer, and it's up to you if you want to take the risk and see if it works or not. We just never had the opportunity to try it. So I hope this video has been helpful. I know there's a lot of people that are scared of these R.E.A.D units, rebuilding them. I hope this video has alleviated some of those fears. If you have any questions, you can use the contact page on the website volvo.com. And while I have your attention, I'm going to do some shameless self-promotion of some other products that I've invented and that I sell. The first product here is a product I invented called Tubanu. If you've ever worked with caulk products, you use half a tube of caulk, you put it downstairs in your basement, you put it out in your garage, when you go back to use it, it's all dried out in the tip. If you're like me, you tried nails, you tried caps, you tried wire nuts, you tried the little rubber condoms, but you go back a couple months later and it's hardened up. So with Tubanu, what you do is you just chop off the top section of the tube, like that. You put the Tubanu on there like that, and now you can use up the rest of the tube. So you're not throwing away good product. Tubanu.com or Amazon if you're interested in that product. As an extension of that, I also sell reusable puck tubes. It's essentially a caulk tube without the top and a Tubanu, and I sell them with plungers, and you can use that for dispensing all sorts of products. Again, Amazon is the best place to get those. I also sell empty tubes, and last but not least is a soap dispensing handle for the famous Smiling Scrub Daddy sponge. The sponge just goes on like that, and we press here, the soap comes out here, so that also is available on Amazon. And of course, there's the R.E.A.D products on the website. I sell rebuilt R.E.A.Ds, I sell the tools, and I sell the bearing kit to rebuild the R.E.A.D. If you're interested in experimenting with those bearings for the drive gear, just use the contact page and let me know, and we'll make arrangements to sell the bearings to you.